glad you can join us. And I'm currently president of Upstream Management Solutions. Today, we're going to share the findings from our regulatory website transparency index. And that extends into a discussion around a transparency and public interest diagnostic that I've put together. So the ORWTI tells us what the public can see on regulator websites. TPI diagnostic asks the next question, which is what does transparency, accountability, and public protection, and what do those signals look like when they are working well across the broader communication and governance ecosystem? So this is part of a broader regulatory capacity system that links strategy and regulatory approaches, performance, transparency, stakeholder engagement, and service design. And of course, we're recording this today. We post it up on YouTube and on our website. If you don't want to be seen publicly, you can turn off your camera. Otherwise, we'll just sort of continue. Okay, so transparency is not an option for regulatory bodies. Delegated authority requires that there is visible accountability. And for the most part, most of the members of the public also want and know that the primary source of information on the regulator is their website. And to that end, the transparency can build the trust, the credibility, and the confidence that goes with that. But it's useful to distinguish that there are three stages of maturity. There's the information stage, which explains the rules, the processes, and the requirements. Fairly basic, straightforward stuff. Transparent going beyond that. And it shows the decisions, the outcomes, the kind of trade-offs that were required to reach those decisions and outcomes. And the third level is what I call active transparency, which goes further still. It shows how the regulator communicates, engages, and responds in real time and through a variety of mechanisms. So that can be newsletters, webinars, town halls, social media, podcasts, inquiry handling. And while the websites are foundational, they're not the entire story. And the challenge for regulators, as I see it, is to move towards a more active transparency. So to assess transparency on websites, we created the ORWTI. We reviewed 42 Ontario profession regulators' websites using 5 different domains and 32 criteria, and each was scored 0, 1, or 2 and normalized across that to up to 100, basically based on its presence. And our purpose on doing this was to establish comparability amongst and across regulators and across the domains and to look for patterns that would go on. So the first big pattern that we see is the sector is relatively and moderately transparent, but not uniformly so. The scores spread across a wide range, yet most regulators cluster somewhere in the middle. Only a relatively small number reach a leading tier, and that tells us that the issue is not whether transparency exists at all. The issue is consistency, intentionality, and how mature it actually is. What we're seeing is that the maturity of the transparency activity is evolving on a sector-wide basis. This does reflect a broader shift in expectations from simply publishing information towards demonstrating effectiveness, accountability, and responsiveness. The second big gap is where transparency seems to fall away. Looking at this chart, I've broken it down by those 5 domains. We can see the regulators are generally stronger at publishing their governance and policy information. That tends to be on the highest side than they are, say, at talking about performance. And that should be a little bit over here. That's what happens when we move stuff around too much. Basically, the performance levers are much lower when we talk about KPIs, service standards, strategic progress, visible accountability. What we tend to see across the board is that health regulators are outperforming non-health ones in all 5 domains. The more important is that weakness we mentioned around the performance, really demonstrating performance and explaining those systems rather than just basically whether they're working. So while there is a certain level of competition, I thought it would still be appropriate to at least give credit where credit is due based on the score to see where regulators line up. And perhaps not surprisingly, all of the top 12 are health colleges. And I think that, in fact, um, reflects a couple of different things. Um, that you may not be familiar with. There's something called the CMPF, CPMF, which is the College Performance Measuring Framework, and that's been in place for about 6 or 7 years. And it's an expectation around how health colleges have to function, looking at outcomes. So they've gotten used to this as an additional piece of published information and performance that's very much part of it, in addition to the usual things that everybody has to submit, like the stuff for the Fairness Commissioner on the fair registration practices. And as well, of course, you have annual reports, you have strategic plans, things of that sort that go on. But they seem to be working better at it. I think it also reflects that there is an informal association of the health colleges, so they are working together collaboratively on a number of different initiatives. And of course, they share the same regulatory framework, which is the Regulated Health Professions Act. And so that is why perhaps one reason why it shows up there, certainly seem to be under more public scrutiny. And so maybe that is the other reason why they tend to do a better job at being transparent, at least as far as their website goes. However, the transparency of the website is great. It's necessary, but it's not the whole story. And what the ORT doesn't fully capture is what the regulator decides to do, but chooses not to publish, how actively a regulator communicates, how easy it is to make an inquiry and to get a response, whether the board or council's agenda time is actually focused on public protection matters, or whether decision matters visibly use evidence, risk, and proportionality. This is why we need a second diagnostic layer that we can apply, and something that we developed, which I'll talk about now. So there are things that we can do to support regulators through an individual transparency scorecard, website diagnostics and roadmap, implementation pathways, and a staged transparency improvements, as well as KPI development, reporting design, and board briefings. And I have put some of these together in a short sector analysis on that evolution from passive transparency to more active and performance-oriented public accountability, which I'm happy to share afterwards. And it's in an article format. It's not that long. It's about 2.5 pages. And the goal is really not just about building better websites, but rather being more strong and visibly public in terms of their accountability. So I want to introduce here something called the Transparency in Public Interest, or TPI, diagnostic and roadmap. And this is part of a larger system that I'm putting together around regulatory capacity. Transparency is one portion of it. And we can see that there are the 4 domains, a lot of things that do overlap with what we started with the ORTI, but they go beyond. So each one has a scoring rubric that goes with it. The first one is covering public-facing transparency based on what's visible, what's accessible on the website, and other public materials, so fairly straightforward. The second domain is looking at decisions and governance, how policies are developed, decisions made, and their rationales, and the accountability structures. The third domain over here is on regulatory focus on public protection. In other words, how does the board or council, when it meets, what percentage of items are actually showing up on its agenda for decision, for information, for discussion, and what are those things based on? Are they typically focused on regulatory matters? Are they focused on association matters? Are they focused on advocacy? Are they focused on administration? Things and governance issues that tend to sort of take up a fair bit of time. So we want to look at the agenda content, the outcomes, and the evidence, and any kinds of risk and proportionality signals. And finally, the last domain is associated and concerned more with the active level, namely how well the regulator communicates, reaches, and engages its various publics. There are a variety of channels, and how well it responds to information requests. So when we apply the diagnostic, there are 16 criteria within those 4 domains. It's based on a review of your website and other publications, active communication channels, and responsive to signals. We then generate a customized profile with scores and maturity index. Regulators use the board agenda attention matrix, or BAM, to review their governance agendas to determine the proportions of regulatory versus governance or administrative items over the past year. Next, we interpret the patterns and identify where the regulator's strengths and weaknesses lie and the opportunities that might exist for improvement. This leads to a roadmap of options for improvement over a defined period of time and sort of a structured build out that is based on capacity, based on resources, and the concrete actions that you can take in a staged and planned manner with the most relevant kinds of yields. So in closing, let's say that transparency is no longer just about being open and increasingly it's not a standalone capacity. It reflects how well strategy, performance, and engagement are working together as a system. It's really about being understandable, measurable, responsive, and visibly focused on public protection. So the question for regulators is no longer what do we publish? It's rather what do we make visible and what does that say about how we regulate? And if this is something that your organization is thinking about, I'm happy to share a quick benchmark or compare where you might sit relative to others in the sector. And with that, I will close. And if you have any questions at the moment, I'll stop sharing and we can sort of go ahead and do that.